Hi, this is Fihan. The internet is a wonderful place. In my opinion, the Polish speaking part is great, and thanks to AI, I can bring you some content in a slightly more accessible way. Today, I've got another video from Snakeiter for you, this time diving into the world of video games. In this episode, he takes a closer look at one of the most important titles ever created by the Polish studio CD Projekt Red. Highly recommend checking it out.
Let's talk about The Witcher. It's a heavy topic. Not for me, but for the people who have categorized this game as the most outstanding title of the past decade. It's been 9 years since the release of The Witcher 3. Everyone has heard of it, and due to the extremely low prices at which this title is available during sales, almost everyone has had the chance to play it. So, has enough time passed for everyone to have outgrown the initial awe over this game? We'll see that from the comments. The Witcher is a sacred game. You cannot insult The Witcher. Even my friends jokingly warned me against making this video. One of them even said that I woke up and chose war.
It's hard to deny that this game has developed a bit of a cult following, at least here in Poland. It's probably the most iconic Polish title out there, and honestly, one of the best. A small source of national pride, no doubt.
At the release of this title, reviewers were raving about the combat system, RPG mechanics, openness, and storyline. Today, I'll try to show you that they were talking nonsense. Oh, and two things. First, this video contains spoilers. However, segments that directly pertain to the ending will be marked in the chapter title. Secondly, before you explode in the comments, this video is a critical analysis of the game, not a review. I don't present many positives in it. The Witcher, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. It also doesn't mean that you can't like the game or have fun with it. This is not strictly an attack on your favorite game, or on you as its fans. This is an attack on the journalism industry that elevated it to the status of a title created by gods. If you like the game's story, its mechanics, or world building, there's nothing strange or wrong about that, because it's not a bad game. It's just not perfect, as some claim. There's no need to spit venom, and if you'd like to add something, I'm more than willing to engage in a discussion with anyone who has reasonable arguments. That's enough of an introduction. Let's talk about The Witcher. The Witcher 3 is an open-world RPG game. And that's already the first lie that has been instilled in players both by the game's creators and by influential content creators who have been milking the topic of this game for literal years. The Witcher 3 is not an RPG game, and I say this in favor of the title, because if we were to classify it as such, it would be a very weak game. RPGs. So let's start with what RPGs actually are, because even that is confusing to some people. The term itself originates from board games. It was an abbreviation for the term role-playing game, which means a game of role-playing. The most popular titles were, of course, games like Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, or Warhammer. The idea of these games was that players created characters for a planned storyline, and then throughout the game, they developed it both narratively and mechanically. Participants in the game took on these roles, acting out their behaviors and reactions in situations overseen by the game master. They also participated in various battles or other actions using the mechanics outlined in the rulebook, and then for their successes, they were rewarded with character advancements that allowed for their development.
I really like how the roots of RPG games were explained here. You're probably starting to see where this is going and why some people argue that The Witcher doesn't quite fit the RPG label. But hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Later, CRPG games focused on transferring these concepts into the digital world. Sometimes using existing systems, like in Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter, which employed the D&D system, but sometimes using proprietary solutions, as in the case of Fallout or Divinity. If we were to define the characteristics of this genre, we should include games that have a character-building system, featuring at least a system of statistics, progression, combat, etc. By the way, bonus points if non-player characters also adhere to this system, like for example, in Fallout. Additionally, players have the ability to relatively freely create their character through a mechanical progression system, but also through narrative. And we can also include features that generally come to mind for everyone, but are not 100% fundamental, like quest systems, player team development, etc.
Alright, I think we've got a pretty clear picture now of what the author means by RPG games. And I've got to say, I really like the approach taken here. In my opinion, it's something that should be at the top of the list in any serious debate. Start by defining the key term. Once the boundaries of the discussion are set, it's much easier for people on the fence to understand the issue, and maybe even change their minds if the definition hits the mark.
Let's extract 3 keywords from this: character creation, development, and impact on their actions. There are good games that implement only some of these features. Then we can describe them as games with RPG elements. Take, for example, Diablo, which belongs to the hack-and-slash genre that draws from RPGs. Before we return to The Witcher, let's highlight one very important thing. The term role-playing game should not be taken 100% literally, because you can't call a game an RPG just because
Sorry about that part. I'm not exactly sure how to fix it, so let me just explain. We can't call a game an RPG just because we take on a character and play out their role.
you assume and play a character. If that were the case, then Call of Duty would be an RPG because you play as a soldier there. Some also say it's about the choice system or extensive dialogues. This would make RPGs titles from Telltale. But let's return to our 3 golden rules: character creation, character development, and player impact. The Witcher 3 does not possess any of these elements.
I think we can all agree that you can't really classify a game as an RPG just because it checks one specific box. It takes a combination of elements working together to truly make a game feel like an RPG.
Character creation in this game does not exist because the character is predefined. We have no possibility of distributing statistics, choosing a class, or anything like that. And that makes sense, because Geralt is a character who is very well established by the books and previous parts of the game. Geralt cannot be a mage, an archer, or a thief. He is a witcher, a warrior trained in sword fighting. However, this means that the fundamental consequence of having RPG systems, which is the ability to make a replay of the game allow for trying out different playstyles, automatically falls away. This option is inherently impossible to implement in this particular game, so let's not focus on it. This is not a downside. Let's just call The Witcher an action game with RPG elements and move on.
I don't know about you, but I can easily name a game where, right after starting, I'm already planning where to put my skill points, how I'll build my character, and even whether they'll be an honest hero or take the shady route. And as Snakeiter rightly pointed out, the lack of that kind of system in The Witcher isn't a flaw. It just shows that it's an action game with RPG elements, not a traditional role-playing game.
Character development. This is a tough topic. In the previous episode, I mentioned Fallout 3. I mentioned that its perks were boring. If the perks in Fallout 3 were boring, then I don't know what to say about this. The mess that was added to The Witcher. This system is simply primitive. Practically none of the perks provide real bonuses. And by real bonus, I mean a perk that actually changes our approach to the game. Adds some mechanics, develops another, makes us notice a change after leveling up. Here, that doesn't happen because those changes aren't there. Increasing the strength of one of the attacks or the power of a sign or boosting the critical chance by 4% are things you don't feel because they are microscopic bonuses that, after investing 4 levels into them, will make you kill an enemy 1 second faster. And the developers probably noticed how silly it was, because 7 years after the release, they significantly buffed half of those perks. But it still doesn't matter because now we'll kill an enemy 2 seconds faster. The game realistically offers a few sensible perks. Alternative sign modes, which are still not worth using because they are useless in most situations, or the whirlwind, which is the only interesting thing in this. Throughout the entire tree, this system can simply be ignored and our gameplay will be almost identical.
So basically, the player is given the illusion of character development for someone who's already fully shaped. Something that could just as easily be skipped. Sure, credit where it's due. The devs eventually made that mechanic a bit more meaningful, but at the end of the day, it's still an add-on, not one of the core pillars of the gameplay.
And the impact of players' decisions, because this game has almost no significant choices. It also disregards all the decisions from The Witcher 2, and let's stay on this for a moment. At the beginning of the game, we can transfer our choices from the second game. This includes sparing some jerk from the intro, the choice between Roche and Iorveth, killing one of the sorceresses, and whether we fought Letho at the end of the game. That's it. These are all the choices from the second game that the game considers significant. The third game also disregards all possible endings of the previous part. Nilfgaard invades Temeria anyway, because it's crucial for the plot. It doesn't matter whether we saved Foltest's bastards or persuaded Roach to ally with Redania, these choices are simply ignored. We can transfer the choice with Eorveth, but it doesn't change the game in any way, because he doesn't appear in it anyway. Well, okay, let's say it had to be this way, because otherwise the game would be extremely difficult to design and equally inaccessible for players who haven't played the second one. However, even if we use this argument, we can respond with a fundamental question. Why add choices that affect the game's ending if the next game, which is a direct continuation, is going to completely ignore them? It simply makes the player feel ignored because most of the previous part turned out to be just an illusion of choice and a plain disappointment. But as if that wasn't enough, almost none. of the choices made in the third part itself also matter. In fact, all decisions can be divided into three groups. Those affecting who will participate in the Battle of Kaer Morhen, those having local consequences concerning literally a few threads, and finally, those choices that matter for the ending. We'll talk about the latter when we discuss the storyline. Let's focus on the first two. None of the choices in The Witcher matter beyond the quest in which we make them. There are very few exceptions, including the aforementioned Battle of Kaer Morhen, but this just means that these characters will simply appear in one task, more with a few seriously small exceptions. Additionally, it's evident that in some cases, the creators assumed that a certain portion of the options would simply not be chosen by anyone. That's why they exist there for the sake of it, and to a large extent they spoil the narrative structure.
A slightly longer segment, but definitely worth listening to all the way through. Minor or meaningless choices in games can actually be a problem. They can break immersion and make the experience feel off. It also highlights how The Witcher focuses more on telling a set story than letting the player shape their own legend.
Let's take, for example, the mission with Kira. Kira is a longtime friend of Geralt, but she is also very well acquainted with Triss and Yennefer. In one of the quests, Kira puts Geralt to sleep and steals his notes, which he had obtained on her behalf anyway. Geralt can then persuade her to go to Kaer Morhen, allow her to go to Radovid with the notes and get herself killed, or do it himself. To kill a longtime friend over some silly notes. Carrie's friends, who are potential lovers of Geralt, mention this, maybe in one dialogue. But this is not a consequence because the game punishes us for that stupid decision, not a punishment. Choices in this game have their consequences, but they do not affect the entirety or even a larger part of the title. We do not feel the effects of our actions because the game is too shallow for that. If anything, they are very local and confined to the quest they pertain to. And that's a bit sad because these choices are genuinely interesting. We have a lot of moral dilemmas here, often very well known to fans of the books. But if a given decision is to be forgotten as soon as the quest ends, then why implement it into the game? And I'll even give you an example of how this could look. At the beginning of the game, heading to the Baron's castle, we meet his men in a tavern. We don't know who they are. We don't know their initial significance to the plot. If we then go to the castle, we'll meet them at the gate and give them a high five. And that's cool. The game can surprise us, leave a positive impression, pretty nice. But if it happens that we kill them in that tavern, then the game. We'll forget about it after the next quest. It will be mentioned, and we will have a problem entering the castle, and that's it. It won't affect the Baron's quest itself, nor the future approach of any character towards us. Similarly, it has no impact on his further fate, the choice in the task with the botchling. The only thing that affects the entire Baron's questline is the sacrifice of the children, although its significance ends with the storyline itself, which ceases to be relevant to the game.
It's interesting that the developers didn't manage to include even a basic reputation system, or some meaningful reflection of player choices. Aside from one quest, I'm not saying outright that other games did it better, but let's be honest. Most of us can probably name one or two titles that handled this aspect a lot more effectively.
Similarly, it has no significance. The choice of ruler on Skellige, the resolution of the war with Nilfgaard, etc. The game gives us the consequences of these actions, throwing them in our face, and then forgetting about them. This is, by the way, the same thing I criticized in Mass Effect. It's not about having the choices from the beginning of the game define all of our enjoyment of it. Transition, just for the game to remember them. The Witcher simply doesn't do this, even though it could actually use them to influence the storyline of the game. But before we talk about the storyline, let's stay with the gameplay for a moment. The gameplay in this game isn't that bad. It's just shallow and repetitive. And that's not so bad because if we don't have expectations and play this game for maybe an hour or two a day, it doesn't stand out.
So yeah, sounds just right for a casual gamer like me. Lately, I barely find any time to play. Even squeezing in an hour or two a day feels like a luxury I just can't afford right now.
Except for maybe a few elements. Let's start with the combat system. It's simply straightforward. There's clearly inspiration from the Souls games here, as we have dodges with invincibility frames, very characteristic targeting, cameras on enemies, an incredibly agile character, a specific system for blocking attacks, you know what I mean? There are two problems here. The first is the fact that this combat is simplified to the limit of possibilities. Basically, we have a heavy and light attack, signs, two types of dodges, and blocking. That's it. There's no other moveset. Throughout the entire game, Geralt fights practically the same way. Additionally, we have the second issue, which is that this system works in Souls games because the enemy design is somewhat different. What I mean is that Souls games are very skill-based because the enemies in Souls are designed in such a way that even the basic grunts, not to mention the bosses, are simply unique. Many enemies, from whom we often wouldn't expect it, have behavior patterns or passive abilities that will simply punish us for mindlessly charging at the opponent. But the logical consequence here is that by learning the game mechanics and ways to defeat enemies, we can even do it with just a pot on our head, because there, the player's preparation for battles truly matters. And in this context, the enemies in The Witcher are simply poorly designed. They have just a few attacks to their name, 90% of the mobs. Either they charge at us, or they spit something at us. And that's basically it. That's where the entire depth of this system ends. That's why every fight can be resolved by attacking the enemy twice, then dodging and repeating the process anew.
Unfortunately, combat isn't exactly The Witcher's strongest suit. The simple, repetitive clicking might work for someone playing in short bursts without digging too deep into the mechanics. But for players looking for a bit more satisfaction from the gameplay, it can end up being a letdown.
In the meantime, you pump yourself up with potions or apply some defensive sign. I'm not saying that every game should look like Souls, because that would also be boring. I mean a deeper development of several elements of the game, because even in a situation where both the combat and the RPG system are super simple, it continues. Such a game can be salvaged with an interesting design of opponents. That's not the case here, because these opponents are extremely undemanding. Every monster can be defeated on the first or second attempt, simply by swinging your sword in front of you. Of course, as long as you have a sufficient level. And let's not even talk about making any oils or potions, because that's not any preparation for battle. We make each potion and each oil once in the game because they regenerate by using the waiting mechanic. Every oil and every potion is a permanent buff that we can activate in every battle. The only moment when we actually prepare for a fight with a specific opponent is the hunt for the Griffin in White Orchard, because it is scripted. But even this fight can be completed, simply by ignoring it, not making any oils because it is not difficult. There might actually be a moment when we have trouble with a certain opponent. However, Geralt's effectiveness in the books did not stem from his ability to skillfully wield a sword and having good equipment, but from his vast knowledge. Geralt knew every weak point and every behavior pattern of most monsters. His effectiveness came from preparation. Here, we don't need to prepare, because why bother chasing after oils if we can simply level up twice and just kill every mob in 2 hits, since the game will respawn a better sword for us. With levels in The Witcher, more problems start to arise. The first is that by doing all the side content in this game, we can very easily overlevel. The side quests are excellently written here, and that should be noted, but completing them makes the game become almost comically simple. If we first clear a few side areas and then proceed to do the main storyline, the combat in those missions will be just trivial. If you find pleasure in taking down a gigantic monster in 3 seconds after tracking it, and luring it out for the last few minutes, then I don't know what game could disappoint you. Another problem with the leveling system is the level gate. This is probably CD Projekt's favorite mechanic, as it was even implemented in Cyberpunk. The point here is that each area has a specific level of opponents assigned to it. This mechanic is used to focus the player's attention on a specific part of the content, so as not to overwhelm them, and to forcefully prevent them from rushing through the content and potentially ruining their enjoyment of the game.
This is one of those design choices I've never really understood, especially in a game that's marketed as open world. If the devs want to hold the player's hand while telling their story or showing off the world, sure, fair enough. But this particular solution just feels like the easiest way out. Personally, I've always loved those moments in games when I'd unknowingly stumble into an area way above my level. Maybe I got lost at night. Maybe I was just exploring and thought, let's see what's over here. And then suddenly, bam! I'm face to face with an enemy I clearly can't handle. But it wasn't just some random villager with a skull icon over their health bar, looking exactly like the 20 others I mowed down like a one-man army. No, and it was a completely different kind of creature. The kind you take one look at and instantly know, yeah, I'm not supposed to be here.
And this mechanic makes sense if it is well implemented. Take Fallout New Vegas, for example. We start the game in Goose Springs, which is here. The player doesn't know this from the beginning, but their goal is the titular location, New Vegas, and the game leads us around. To allow us to level up, get to know the existing factions, familiarize ourselves with the mechanics, etc. But the fastest route goes this way. However, the developers don't want the player to accidentally ruin the game for themselves. Because if he met Benny right at the start, he wouldn't even know who he is. Instead of satisfaction from the confrontation, he would feel more surprised. That's why this area is filled with Deathclaws, which are some of the tougher opponents in the game. So the player can't unknowingly ruin their experience and makes the natural choice of going in a different direction. And it makes sense because the strength of the opponents blocking our path is reflected both in the game's mechanics and in its world. Let's return to The Witcher now. There, level gating functions in such a way that it blocks game content by artificially inflating the power of opponents. That's why, for example, a drowner encountered in Velen will fall after 3 hits, but the same mob lurking under Novigrad won't be affected by our attacks. This is simply nonsensical. And now, combining this with something as simple as the construction of a flail. With the combat system, we get a game where, upon entering a high-level area, we receive a random hit from a half-naked peasant, who mechanically is no different from a bandit encountered in Velen, and we fall flat, unable to inflict any damage on him. Without being able to exploit any of his weaknesses, points, or mechanics resulting from our character's development. And because the entire game is fought in the same way, those levels are merely a number. We don't get the sense of progression and increasing power of our character, because not only is the perk system lacking, but throughout the game, we fight the same opponents. But let's stay for a moment with level gating and say that we went to an area which is several levels above us. And now comes something that is extremely important in designing games of this type. With every increase in difficulty level, there should be a reward for the player. In The Witcher, this is not the case, because if we go to that area, the equipment we acquire still scales with the player's level. This means that if we open a given container while being at level 10, the armor we find in it will also be around level 10. And even if we acquire an item whose level exceeds our own, we still cannot equip it, because the game does not allow us to do so. If that's how it's supposed to work, then what's the point of adding an inventory system? Because in this situation, changing our gear is not a moment of fulfillment, but just a regular chore. Have you gained 2 more levels? Well, then you'll soon drop a sword that deals 3 more damage points than the previous one. Have fun. And that's exactly how you can look at the entire leveling and progression system in this game. That specific items, which are no different from others, simply deal more damage, because they have better numbers and a better level. It's not like after 15 levels we can go to Novigrad because our character has finally learned something or visibly developed. No, we can go to Novigrad because suddenly better armors and swords appear in the chests. And that's exactly the entire progression system in The Witcher. We level up, so that the game starts randomly spawning for us. Better loot so we can throw away all our gear and equip newly dropped items. The jump in character power doesn't come from new mechanics or visible development, but from the fact that the game started randomly spawning for us. Better items.
I'm not a fan of that kind of system, and honestly, I'm surprised it was implemented at all. Or actually, let me rephrase that. I would be surprised if it showed up in a proper RPG. But as we've already established, The Witcher isn't really an RPG. And if we approach it from that angle, as a story we're meant to experience alongside the main character, rather than shape our own, then honestly, it kind of makes sense. It's just a different approach to storytelling.
A similar problem exists in Skyrim, but at least there we have an RPG system that somewhat reflects our character's development. Finally, Gwent. It's simply unbalanced. 90% of matches can be won by stuffing the deck with spies or gold cards. This is by no means a game that requires logical thinking, because the winner is the one who has the better deck. And not better in the sense of being more cleverly built, but having more absolutely overpowered cards. And if that wasn't enough, the game doesn't limit the size of our deck. And on top of all that, spies allow us to draw so many cards during the game that 90% of NPCs simply run out of everything by the end of the second round. And here lies the whole problem with the gameplay of this game. It's shallowness. The entire title is simple, and its gameplay remains the same throughout.
It kind of kills the replayability of a game like this. And hey, I'm not saying you can't play The Witcher 2, 3, or even 5 times. You totally can. The question is, what actually changes between those playthroughs? Sure, you might come back for the story, and that's totally fine. But what about players who enjoy pushing themselves, setting challenges, or exploring the game from a completely different angle?
The only mechanic we unlock during the game is the ability to use a crossbow, which is only suitable for taking down flying enemies and fighting underwater. And that underwater combat? By the way, it is equally poorly designed. This, combined with the zero impact of our choices, makes returning to the game a tedious and sad experience. And I had the opportunity to hear in the context of these arguments the statement that The Witcher is not Souls, or other variations of the same sentence. And that's true, except that this argument suggests that the only game with complex gameplay is Souls. The game doesn't have to belong to a specific genre or draw inspiration from specific games for its gameplay to have depth. This is all fundamental to the rules of game design, making the gameplay interesting, satisfying, and diverse. Imagine Path of Exile, but throughout the entire game, from the moment you wake up on the beach, you have the same set of attacks where only the damage realistically changes. The whole game would look the same. What would be the point of returning to this title with each new league? Imagine a game like War Thunder or World of Tanks, but throughout the entire game you drive just one type of tank. Imagine Fallout, but the developers remove the RPG systems, the dialogue system, and turn it into a repetitive shooter. Oh no, wait. What I mean is that games are supposed to be interesting and diverse, so as not to create the impression that the whole thing is a chore, where we feel real fulfillment only after crossing off all the things to do from the list. And I think the perfect example of a mechanic that gives such an impression is the open world. The world in The Witcher. Open worlds are a topic I could cover in an entirely separate episode. And I probably will, so let's go over it briefly. There is a very fine line between an open map being an essential part of the game and just an extension of it. Which results from the fact that before we do something interesting, we first have to waste time traveling, from location to location. The only advantage of the open world in The Witcher is that it is beautiful, and that's something that cannot be denied to this game. However, the fact is also that the graphics alone are not a significant advantage of this game because they do not affect our experience as much as the gameplay does. If the gameplay is outstanding and the graphics are terrible, we still have a good game. But if it's the other way around, we have an interactive photo album.
A lot of people would agree with this without even thinking twice. Graphics aren't everything. Sure, The Witcher looks great, sometimes even better than games that came out years later. But visuals are just an extra layer. They're there to enhance the experience, not to be the core of it. Because at the end of the day, it's the gameplay that should hold the whole thing together.
Graphics should be an addition, like the cherry on top. But the open world in The Witcher is not any kind of cake. It's a slice of bread. This open world is simply monotonous, and I'm strictly referring to its gameplay structure. If I were to build a theory, it would sound something like this. The creators made a relatively large map, filled it with quests, but that wasn't enough, so they probably added around 300 question marks without much care, which contain either a somewhat okay quest or one of maybe 5, which add nothing to the game. And let's even say that it might be minimally interesting. It's just some form of grind that some people might even like. But on Skellige, someone must have gone crazy with those question marks. And that's not even my conclusion, but the designer of this game. And before you say that they are not essential to complete the title, let me point out that this is not an argument. It's the same with the Fallout video. Some people wrote that building settlements is not a downside because it's not mandatory. However, that in itself doesn't matter because the optionality of a mechanic doesn't shield it from criticism since playing the game itself is also optional.
I really like this point because lately there's been a trend of brushing off broken mechanics with, well, it's optional, so it doesn't matter. Big props to Snakeiter for pushing back against that kind of reasoning. It's refreshing to see someone call it out.
Besides, if this or any other mechanic were done excellently, CD Projekt would be receiving praise for it. Which is quite interesting considering that even in its current state, the open world is receiving praise. This title doesn't gain any added value from the implementation of an open world, because neither is the world particularly well-filled, nor is the game. It doesn't implement interesting ways to navigate through it. A map like in GTA 5, not only is it quite decently and diversely filled, but it also allows us to move around in a very enjoyable way, because driving cars is pleasant. It's the same in Red Dead, except there are horses there. Here, horseback riding involves holding the left stick and one button on the controller. I'm not even mentioning that we can release the stick and the horse will go to the destination on its own. This game could just as well be based on the structure of The Witcher 2, where the world was limited but divided into open areas. Returning to that system would even be better, because it would eliminate the need for implementing that idiotic level gating I told you about. However, if something like that were implemented, people would complete it several hours faster. This open world is just an artificial extension of the game.
I think this is the most fitting way to put it. Cramming in unnecessary mechanics, stretching out poorly designed maps, all just to squeeze a few extra hours into the game time, and then proudly claim in interviews that it offers 40 hours of gameplay. Of course, no one mentions that 2 of those hours are spent walking through empty areas, 5 are tied to building a pointless village, and another 3 are wasted on a poorly balanced minigame.
Alright, time for the storyline. And honestly, it's not the worst. It's a fairly standard story that, in some aspects, is meant to reference the narrative structure of Sapkowski's books. If I were to criticize it, there would be 3 things. An absolutely tragically written antagonist, a lack of respect for the source material, and numerous dissonances that somewhat tarnish the image of this game in my eyes. This is admittedly a bit of nitpicking, so let's briefly start with that. At the beginning, I'll ask you a simple question. When playing The Witcher 3 for the first time, were you looking for Ciri, playing Gwent, or doing something else? That's kind of a question. Rhetorical. Here, it's worth introducing a certain term, which is ludonarrative dissonance. Let's break it down into its components. Ludos is Latin, a word literally translated as game. From this, terms such as ludology, which is the study of games, hadiashin, and homo ludens, which is the thesis suggesting that the basis of human actions is participating in various games or competitions, are derived. And finally, the mentioned ludonarrative dissonance, which is the difference between the game's narrative and the structure of its world, and the gameplay. I first heard this term, I think, in one of Quaz's videos, but it's something that many people involved in the topic of games mention. For example, in the 2013 Tomb Raider, in a cutscene, Lara Croft cries over her first victim, but soon after she becomes a killing machine. Ludonarrative dissonance. It manifests here in that she suddenly gains abilities characteristic of John Wick, but also completely forgets about her recent moral dilemma. Gameplay does not reflect the cutscenes and vice versa. Other examples include Cyberpunk, where V suffers from an illness but feels great until the story progresses. Meanwhile, in Call of Duty, our character is bulletproof and regenerates in a few seconds until a cutscene starts and the wound becomes significant, story-wise. And these are not critical errors. It's simply bothersome when we start to look deeper into a title. We have the same in The Witcher. The entire story structure builds tension as if finding and saving Ciri is critically important, but the gameplay does not reflect this. How could it reflect this, you might ask? I'll answer.
Ludonarrative dissonance has come up in a lot of great videos and articles about games I've checked out. Snakeiter did a really solid job explaining it with examples. When you take a closer look at a game's mechanics and story, you start to notice more of these inconsistencies. And honestly, I think it's sometimes really hard to avoid them in complex, narrative-heavy games.
In the first real mission in Metal Gear Solid V, we have to find one of the key characters for the story. Our companion informs us that he is in bad shape and that we need to hurry. However, the game provides us with a time-skipping mechanic. So what happens if we wait more than 3 days? Miller will die. The game thus builds tension in the narrative and then implements it into the gameplay. The Witcher does not do this. In fact, I even think it would be brilliant if players faced consequences for their stupidity and carelessness. Approach to the main storyline.
Coming back to the topic of artificially stretching out the game, this fits right in. Because if the player just focused on quickly finding Ciri, they'd probably skip a lot of the content the developers carefully placed throughout the world. And look, I get it. The devs wanted to make sure players experienced all the cool stuff they built. At the same time, they also wanted to tell a tense, slow-burning story. The problem is, those two goals don't quite work together here.
After all, the main line of defense for many fans of this game is that The Witcher is a role-playing game. On the other hand, it is overloaded with additional content to the point where it's hard to ignore, so let's treat this more as a curiosity or nitpicking. Unfortunately, this is not the only example of such dissonance in the entire game. To name a few, minor blacksmiths sell better armor than legendary items obtained from quests or through exploring the game world, which results from the aforementioned scaling of items with the player's level. Drowners near Novigrad are simply stronger than those in White Orchard, which results from the aforementioned level gating. And then the game ignores the entire progression from the previous part, so, at the beginning of the story, Geralt once again struggles with some common wolves, despite having battled gigantic monsters in the second part. All of this makes the world simply inconsistent with the gameplay, and it can be quite jarring. But the story itself also has its problems. So, the search for Ciri is a way. The connection in Geralt's story scenario with the Wild Hunt, which is simply poorly written. Eredin, the main antagonist of the game, speaks exactly 12 sentences throughout the entire title. And now let's return for a moment to the rules of game design. Defeating a significant opponent should provide satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. A very simple and obvious thing. Now let's identify two main ways to build these emotions. The fight with an opponent can give the player satisfaction either through mechanics or through narrative. And again, I'll refer to the Souls games because it's the simplest example in this particular case. So in games from Software, the storyline is convoluted, which is why a new player will have trouble understanding it. But the game focuses on mechanics. The opponents are difficult, and it's not because we need to grind levels to defeat them, but because we need to adapt. Learn the attack patterns, delve into the game mechanics, wisely build the character, and so on. That's why the satisfaction from defeating a boss in Souls games doesn't come from the significance of our opponent in the game's story, but from the journey that the player must undertake themselves. Now let's give an example of the second method. Red is perfect here. Dead 2. This will be difficult without spoilers, so you have a timestamp on the screen. I'll give you a few seconds to pause. So the real antagonist of the game is Mike. Throughout the story, he repeatedly manipulates other characters, lies, and kills the innocent. He is simply a well-written antagonist because his actions affect the player, building negative emotions towards this character. Unfortunately, at the end of Arthur's story, we are not given the chance to kill him. Mike walks away unscathed without facing the consequences of his actions. The player is powerless, unable to do anything about it. That's why when we finally get to kill him at the end of the epilogue, we feel immense satisfaction. On the other hand, The Witcher 3 does not use any of these methods. Killing Eredin is, firstly, mechanically simple, and secondly, absolutely meaningless for the player from the perspective of stepping into the character's shoes. The power and villainy of this character are not developed throughout the entire game. The only consequences of using his destructive power are the death of one significant character and the White Frost, which we see in the game. How many times? About 3 times? The storyline does not build any negative emotions towards Eredin throughout its entirety. This is just another boss, and the fact of knowing his backstory doesn't change much here because, as I said, the player, in any case, doesn't have any emotional connection with him. Geralt kills Eredin, and that's basically it. We move on. Another cutscene, another quest, and we're back in standard mode. And now let's talk for a moment about the game's ending. For a title based on player choices, which is supposedly focused on the storyline, the decisions affecting the endings are downright pathetic. The only choices that really matter in determining the game's ending are whether we act as a yes man for Ciri, fulfilling her every whim. It's literally a few choices. Going for a beer with her, taking her to Emir and accepting money from him, taking her to a friend's grave, going with her to a meeting with the lodge, throwing snowballs, and allowing her to destroy her elven friend's laboratory. Friends. Almost every decision affecting the ending is contained within the last few main quests. So all our actions up to this point have absolutely no significance.
At this point, it's really hard to defend the game. It's not a full-fledged open-world RPG, and for a title that puts so much emphasis on storytelling, it doesn't even give you a memorable final boss. On top of that, your choices barely impact the world around you, and the few that actually matter only show up near the end. The whole game feels artificially stretched out, just to show off all the features the devs packed in.
And I'll even give you an example of how it could look if it were done. Well, throughout the entire game, we make a multitude of meaningless choices. So why not give them significance in the ending? Let's even say that for Ciri to survive this journey between dimensions, she must be in good mental and emotional condition. So let's say Ciri decides to visit an old friend who was the Baron. If she found out that he managed to find his wife and daughter and reconcile with them, it could have a positive impact on her. After all, her companion who saved her life and whose life she saved is finally doing well. But imagine what it would be like if you found out that the Baron hanged himself. That quest would be legendary. It would introduce consequences for the player based on a choice made dozens of hours earlier. It would provoke reflection and admiration for the game's design. Instead, Ciri forgets about the Baron but remembers a random guy, Kudevai, from a backwater village in Skellige. The fate of the sorcerers from Novigrad could have influenced her in the same way, as she herself possesses magical abilities. If she found out that Geralt completely ignored them, she might change her opinion about him, lose respect for him. Instead, we can completely turn off our brains until the Wild Hunt is defeated. Kermoren? Because that's when the choices start to matter. And finally, the aforementioned lack of respect for the source material. What was done with some of the characters is a joke, not a storyline. Killing Vesemir as a plot point that drives the rest of the narrative, because the creators apparently needed some kind of twist to evoke any negative emotions in the player towards Eredin. Which, in my opinion, absolutely did not work. The quest with the assassination attempt during which Dijkstra loses all the aura of a cunning and intelligent guy that the books built up over the years. Dijkstra is a guy who knows Geralt very well. Moreover, he is one of the smartest and best informed people in the kingdom. And what, this guy decided to jump at him with a sword? What the hell? By the way, it's super funny how modders fixed this quest, because a simple modification from Nexus makes a Doppler mutagen drop from Dijkstra's corpse, cutting this great character off from the extreme stupidity of this task.
Once again, modders proved their worth. Sometimes what a team of professionals couldn't quite fix gets sorted out by a bunch of passionate fans. And they do it with heart.
And then there's Kira, who loses all her brain cells, whom you have to stop from certain death, making her the biggest fool of the decade. Some of the characters brought in from the books are simply misrepresented. And I think that's precisely why Sapkowski might not like these games. And that's why I personally don't consider The Witcher 3 neither as the game of the decade nor the best RPG of all time, nor the most outstanding role-playing game, or anything else that might be attributed by journalists or internet creators. But why is The Witcher so beloved? It's simply a decent title. An excellent game for people who previously had nothing to do with RPGs. A pretty cool introduction to the world of games if you haven't been able to get into something like this before. I would even call it a nice treat for people who are into books and who have a high tolerance for nonsense. It's simply a game that doesn't overwhelm the player with mechanics, but allows them to enjoy these simple, yet at times decent stories.
The Witcher 3 has a lot of good going for it. It's objectively a solid game. No doubt about that. It's often considered the best Polish game ever made, and honestly, there's probably some truth to that. It gained massive popularity, and if we judge its quality by how well-known and influential it is, then yeah, it's definitely something special.
Because I honestly like the storyline of the Baron. In fact, as a fan of the priest, I might even love the segment in Kaer Morhen. The quests in this game can leave us pondering about morality. The dialogues are well and credibly written. The level Ashos design is excellent. The world is beautiful and believable. The expansions are well thought out. The soundtrack is absolutely outstanding. But playing through this game more than once, or starting it for the first time with any expectations, is simply a disappointment. And I have no problem with people who like this game. This is where the whole point of this material lies. I just hate gaming journalists.
At least we get where Snakeiter is coming from. Alright, maybe it's worth talking a bit more about that frustration. A lot of it stems from the overhype around certain games, even when they've got obvious bugs, flaws, and design issues. It's also that feeling when you drop full price on a game because everyone's calling it a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. And then 2 or 3 hours in, you start noticing things that really shouldn't exist in something that's supposed to be near perfect and costs $60. Let's be honest, who hasn't fallen for a glowing review, only to end up with a painfully average game?
Because the only problem lies in the articles, videos, or other forms of media that the authors create about this title. Some kind of divine RPG. A game of the past decade that would outsell New Vegas, Souls, Mass Effect, Zelda, GTA, Red, Dead, or a bunch of other titles that were simply much more well thought out. The Witcher 3 is a product designed to reach a mass audience. Which product, to facilitate its consumption, has been simplified to the level of a game that pretends to have meaningful choices, that pretends to have a good RPG system, that pretends to have a good open world. But ultimately that doesn't mean the game isn't good. I have spent about 150 hours on The Witcher across all platforms. And honestly, I don't regret the time I dedicated to exploring this story and completing this title. It didn't change my life and it's not a game of the decade. But does it have to be? That's all. Thank you all for watching the video to the end and for the positive reception of the previous material. As usual, I greet the viewers from the stream and encourage you to leave something on the channel. I hope you won't lynch me after this material. Until next time.
Thanks again for checking out the video. I've always been passionate about video games, even if I don't always have enough free time to dive into every title as deeply as I'd like. Still, I really enjoy listening to thoughtful takes and fresh perspectives on gaming. This video took a while to put together, but I'm hoping the next one will be up sooner. I've already got a few ideas, now it's just a matter of making them happen. That's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I've watched it multiple times myself. I'll include a link in the description to this channel and this specific video in case anyone wants to see the original. I can see that the translation isn't perfect, but I'm still impressed with the result. I'll try to make the next videos even better. Take care, everyone, and see you next time.